Hey guys, it's Emily. Welcome back to Telltale. Greg and I are going to be reviewing Homer's The Iliad today. So, Synopsis Trojan War. Yeah. So, Helen gets stolen away by the king of Troy, and the rest of the nations and allies of her people decide to go and fight to get her back. Most of the story is basically the story of Achilles and Hector. Hector is the Trojan hero and Achilles is the Achaean hero. And of course, we all kind of know the myths surrounding those two characters a little bit. Spoiler alert if you don't. Hector gets killed. Achilles does too. In fact, it was prophesied to him that he was going to die within the walls of Troy, but not before he killed their main hero, Hector. So he kind of went into battle knowing his doom was coming, which is kind of an interesting character development, but it also makes you wonder because Achilles kind of hangs back a lot. He's kind of mad at Helen's husband for being a jerk, and certain kings have stolen his girlfriend too. So basically the moral of this story is stop stealing women or taking each other's wives. Why is that even a thing? Whatever. Anyway, Greeks are weird. Their culture's weird. They have all kinds of myths. But what I have to say, the value in the story is not just the historical part. Because we do have to admit that, yes, Troy fell. And it fell to Achilles and them. But what I like is the interspersed myths that happen within this story. Because this book is a war book. There's a lot of name dropping. Good luck pronouncing them, by the way. But yeah, lots of name dropping. Who killed who, blah, 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 and how. It's actually pretty gory. One of the things I also want to mention is that this piece of literature that Greg and I are reading was actually translated by Sam Butler. So you may know kind of the prose version where it's actually poetry. This version that Greg and I have read is more of a novelization. And it's really, really interesting because I actually found I preferred it. I had actually had to read the Iliad and the Odyssey in high school, and we read the version that was kind of a poetry version, and I really had a hard time with it because I'm like, what the heck does all this mean? But the novelization was easier for me to swallow, just because it was a narrative. It was a storyline. A little dry in some places, but the myths were interesting because you get other histories too. It's really good at going off on rabbit trails and tangents because, interspersed it says, so-and-so died this way, and he was the blah-blah-blah who did blah-blah-blah with whatever god and goddess, or, they kind of give you the significance of those who died in little tangents, little pieces of myths and histories kind of interspersed together that I think are most of the value of this piece of literature, not just for the historical aspect, but a lot of these myths and stuff are not accounted anywhere else. So you get these little pieces of myth and history that and they just don't exist anywhere else. So I really appreciated that because you kind of get a more holistic view of the culture, who people were, why it was significant that they were mentioned, and things like that. So if you can get past some of those things, which I found was probably more fascinating than the main storyline, this is actually a really significant and really interesting piece of literature. It's also a very ancient piece of literature. So that's another historical significance, is that it survived from being entirely an oral history to suddenly being a piece of literature, and in fact, one that we still read and is significant today. So really interesting book. It is a long one. So you got to push through it. A lot of the times, I think people go into it and read it, and it's it's hard to, because one, most of us have encountered it as an assignment for school, because it is in a lot of literature classes in colleges as well as in high schools. So I think for that reason, a lot of people have a hard time reading it, or have chosen not to read it, because it's hard to be assigned something. Also, it is very dry in some points because it is just telling you facts. I think what makes this interesting is that those facts are interspersed with myth, how they perceive gods and goddesses assisting them, how they personify those gods and goddesses, how those gods and goddesses choose to interact with people, how they're convinced that certain characters are the sons and daughters of gods and goddesses. Like Achilles, as far as we know, was a real person, but they thought he was a god, or part god at least. So it's really interesting to kind of see how these cultures reconciled certain events, how they reconciled the greatness of people, and how they interspersed the myths with the with a lot of the historical things. So it's kind of hard to read too, because you're sitting there wondering, like, so what actually happened? Because what you end up getting in a lot of these war stories is that the winner gets to write history. So you don't know how much of it is actually true, because, you know, big egoed humans tend to write whatever they feel like to make them feel good about what they've done. So you don't necessarily know what is truth or fiction. Even like parts with gods and goddesses, like how do they reconcile those conversations had between a goddess and a person? Like, interesting thoughts that I had while reading this piece of literature. But yeah, I think the hardest part with this piece of literature was its dryness and the name dropping. I can't pronounce most of those names. The only reason I knew any of the names is because I had heard them said to me forever ago in high school. Some of them, you try to read it and it's like, oh, it is literally all Greek to me. Like, I can't, yeah. So I had a hard copy, so it's like, I had this book. I can't just go into, like, my app and, like, highlight it and get, you know, Siri to tell me how it's pronounced. So I was like, I don't know what to do. So a lot of that I just kind of skipped over, because that was really difficult for me to try and, like, I would get so fixated on trying to read the name of the person as phonetically as possible that I would start missing the story. So a lot of it I had to skim read and just, like, realize this person who starts with whatever was significant for this reason. Just because it does kind of intersperse those tangents between, like, so-and-so killed so-and-so, and so-and-so was significant because he was, you know, he did this, or he was the son of so-and-so, or, you know, whatever. So it was kind of one of those things where you just, for the sake of my sanity, I had to skip over a lot of the names and just glean the idea of the person instead of knowing their actual name, which is kind of sad. If you're a person who really likes knowing names and name dropping, though, this is a great book for you. So yeah, I have to say I enjoyed it. I tend to really enjoy dry literature, though. The world building is amazing. I mean, it's sparse, but, like, you still get enough information that your mind can build it. And also I had a nice book that had maps and things, so I knew where stuff was, so I could always reference those. I love books with maps. I love that. I want to know where those places are. I want to know where they are now compared to what our modern maps are, so I really appreciate literature that does that. So yeah, I have to say I enjoyed this one. It is hugely significant to history. It's hugely significant to the morphing of literature from from being entirely orally presented versus becoming literature. So yeah, and I love thinking about how much the story may or may not have changed as you play telephone and give this story to other people and how they just choose to present it. So I would have loved to be back in the day and heard Homer tell it, allegedly. Allegedly it was Homer who told it. But, you know, just being able to hear it firsthand versus what it's become now, I think is a fascinating thing to wonder about. So, yeah, I really like this one. I hope you did too. I definitely say it's worth a read. Like the Samuel Butler version, if you had a hard time with the poetry, I can recommend the Samuel Butler version because it novelizes things really well. You get a better understanding, I think, of what's going on because you're not caught in the poetry of it. You're just reading the story as it is. So that was super helpful for me. So yeah, if you guys like, subscribe, let us know what you thought, which version of the Iliad you had, which translations you had. We're starting to realize that those kinds of things are more significant. I was actually even talking to Greg about it. Like, I have a really hard time with Around the World in 80 Days. It was a French book. Maybe I just read the wrong translation. So yeah, discuss that. See if that makes a difference. What versions did you read of the Iliad when you were in college or school, or if you chose to read it on your own? I think that's interesting to bring up as well. And if you've read multiple versions of it or multiple translations of it, let us know and tell us which ones you preferred. So again, like, subscribe, let us know what you thought. We'd love to talk to you. Have a good one.
The Iliad by Homer is, of course, part of a duology, the Iliad and the Odyssey, one of the most famous series of books in all of literature. The original was done in verse, and it was passed down through oral tradition, meaning it wasn't originally written. People memorized the whole thing, which is pretty amazing if you read this, to have to memorize all that stuff. Now, I'm sure the people that repeated it, they embellished it or changed it as their memory served them, and so the story, I'm sure, changed over time. And we have no way of knowing how, because it wasn't written down until long after it had started. And it's thought to have been written by Homer, a blind poet, but that could be myth itself. It's thought that maybe Homer didn't exist, that the attribution to that person is fictional. And it's even thought that the Iliad and the Odyssey were originated with two different people. That's a popular theory of Samuel Butler, who wrote a whole book about how he felt the Odyssey was written by a woman, which could, well, I haven't read the Odyssey yet, but definitely the Iliad is very masculine. So these stories originated before Christ, more than 2,000 years ago. Not sure just how long ago, in ancient Greece. And were passed down through oral tradition, finally were written down. They've been translated many times. I, of course, am reading English editions. Now, I started out with this paperback edition from Signet, translated by W.H.D. Rouse. Started trying to read this, and I just wasn't getting into it. It just wasn't interesting. It was very hard to read. It was very dull. It wasn't engaging. I didn't like it. But I thought, this is a translation. There are other people who translated it. Maybe one of the other translators did a better job with English. So Emily gave me an extra copy she had of the Samuel Butler translation, which is a prose version also. The Rouse version is a prose version of the book. The Samuel Butler version of the Iliad and the Odyssey are also prose. I found the Samuel Butler version much more readable, much more enjoyable. Still kind of hard to read, but a lot more engaging, a lot more interesting, a lot more exciting. And I also started reading the Alexander Pope verse version of the Iliad, which I think is the best of all of them, because even though it's still kind of hard to read and there's a lot to it, it's harder to follow the story in the verse version, like Emily says, but at least the rhythm of the words are a lot more interesting, and it just kind of flows, and I just find it a more enjoyable read to read the verse version. But I do really love the Butler version. Now, Life Interferes. This is a hard to read book. I've been struggling to get through it. I'm really only 2/3 of the way done at this time. But the Iliad is a famous enough story that I feel we can do this video, since we have it scheduled to release tomorrow night as I'm shooting this. I gotta just go ahead and give my impressions, even though I got another third of the book to go yet. The Iliad, like I said earlier, is a very masculine story. Emily said she really liked it, but by today's standards, the treatment of women in this book is horrible. And her being such a devout feminist, I was actually kind of surprised she liked it as much as she did, because almost every time one of the Greeks or Trojans opens their mouth, they're talking about going and stealing the women and raping them and stealing all the gold and killing all the men and burning all the houses down. I mean, it is a very male-centric story. And women are treated like commodities. They're like vases. They're like cattle. They're not people. They're not respected. Their opinions aren't respected. Men just do what they want with them. So if you're going to read the Iliad, be prepared for that. If you're bothered by that kind of thing, understand that, possibly 3,000 years ago, people were a lot different than us. And and yes, this society was very male-oriented, and women were treated like crap. That said, the surprising thing I found, and I wish I could read Greek, because I'd like to know if the closest to original Greek version that's been handed down to us has as much bloody, graphic description as our English books do. There's descriptions of, a soldier shoving his spear into another guy's, through a guy's helmet, through the skull, into the brain, and pushing the brains. I mean, literally, that's how they're kind of how they're talking about the descriptions of these battles. They're very bloody, very violent, very graphic. Now, it was written in verse, in poetry. And so there's a lot there that I feel, there's a lot to the book that's part of the way they used to relate stories back then. I mean, it was always in verse. I mean, even Greek plays were in verse. And books like this, the Bible and such, there's a lot of description that is about handing down traditions. And it really goes into way more detail than you really need to get the story. So you have to wade through a lot of back detail that seems extraneous. It's a little hard to be spending 3 paragraphs reading about how this guy was, the son of this guy who was the son of this guy, and they went and did this, and they did that, and this happened, and they affected these other people, and now this guy's in battle at Troy. And 2 sentences later, he's lying dead on the ground. I mean, do you really need to know all that detail about the character's backstory if he's just going to get killed right away? If he's just cannon fodder? So from modern writing standpoints, there's a lot that could be just cut from this novel, edited out, and it would be a stronger modern story. But of course, translators don't do that. They want to remain faithful to the original. And so if you want to read this, you're going to have to wade through all that stuff. But it's worth it. It is a truly great story. It is amazing. As Emily mentioned, all the mythology behind this. There's history behind this. The Trojan War, I'm pretty sure, was real. Some of the people that were involved in it were real people. And so you don't really know how much is fiction and how much is history in here. Pretty sure there's a lot of fiction, but pretty sure there's also some solid history here of what happened in the Trojan War. So it's an amazing book, but as I mentioned earlier, you've got to get the right version for you. The Samuel Butler translation is the most popular, it's the most common, and it's the most readable for modern readers. The Rouse version, like I said, you can read it, but it's not very enjoyable. And the Alexander Pope version, of course, is poetry. It's verse, like the original story was. So if you don't like poetry, if you find that hard to follow through this kind of deep story, then the Alexander Pope version isn't for you. But I really like the Pope version. I haven't read the whole thing, but I read quite a ways into it, and I was really enjoying that version. So the next thing we're going to do, as soon as I get through the last third of this book, is we're going on to the Odyssey. I have the Alexander Pope version of the Odyssey. I have the Samuel Butler version in an ebook of the Odyssey. I also have an ebook of the Odyssey that was written by William Morris. Now I'm really curious to read that one. Lots of copies of this story around, so it's easy to get a hold of. And lots of free ebooks too, out on Kindle and Apple Books, Project Gutenberg. Go out and get it, read it, enjoy this one. But be prepared to work. It's not an easy read. Till next time, happy reading.